There have been indiscriminate bombing across the entirety of the Gazan Strip.
Are we talking about a war here? Is it a war? Is it in any way comparable, the two sides here?
You can imagine like Gaza is on the borders of Sindh.
Okay.
13 Gazas can fit in Karachi city.
Could you also add what common person can do to amplify the voices of the Palestinians?
My way to go is BDS, 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 which is boycott, divest, and sanctions movement.
Okay. And cue.
As journalists, we are told to strictly keep our objectivity and integrity intact while reporting on a subject matter. But what is objectivity? Does it mean that you have to equate the two sides that otherwise hold no comparison whatsoever? Or does it mean that you have to make sure the facts, the figures, and the statistics are in place? Well, the most honest and the most credible of our journalists have often been bullied into equating the two situations like that. They are often harangued into supporting the superior side, which obviously goes against minority. For example, what's happening in Gaza or Palestine for that matter at the moment, can we call it a war-like situation, or is it a genocide underway? Can we call this flare-up a series of conflicts, or has it been an apartheid, a continuous one, which has been going on for decades? We'll talk about this. And having set the pace and the preface for this conversation, I'm just going to limit myself and introduce you to our panelists, our esteemed panelists who have honored us today. They are Palestinians, and they will lend us some context of the situation. And as Pakistanis have always wanted to express their solidarity and support towards the Palestinian cause, they will help us understand what's actually going on here. We have with us Mr. Karabash and Ms. Laila AlQirim. Without further ado, I'm just going to pass it over to them. Could you please introduce yourself a little so that we can have a better conversation about what's going on?
I'm a Palestinian Pakistani. I live in Karachi at the moment, and with everything going on in Gaza, we found that it was most appropriate that you guys hear our perspective of the story and our take on it.
And I grew up in a bunch of places, but right now I live in Karachi with my family. I've been here for about a year and it's been nice so far, alhamdulillah.
Could you just simply walk us through what happened in the recent past?
So on the 7th of October, resistance fighters launched attacks on the settlements that are on the border of Gaza. So these are occupied lands. They're under Israel, the occupying territory, but they are all occupied. These are Palestinian lands they have, and they always will be. Now, there are a lot of contested facts and figures happening. You know, some people say civilians were killed. Others are saying the occupation bombed their own civilians. I would recommend looking into the Hannibal directive, but that's not what I want to get into. What I want to get into is the events that happened subsequently.
Okay, let's talk about the subsequent events first.
There have been indiscriminate bombing across the entirety of the Gazan Strip. So Gaza, for those of you that don't know, is an open-air prison. It's actually the world's largest open-air prison. It is only 45 kilometers squared, okay, and it has 2 million people. To give our viewers at home some context, Karachi city, so the proper Karachi, not even the entirety of Karachi, is
downtown city.
Yeah, it's 591 kilometers squared.
Okay.
13 Gazas can fit in Karachi city.
Okay.
13 of them.
And in one of them, they have banded together over 2 million.
Over 2 million. So you've got an occupying force, that's Israel. They can switch the water and the electricity on and off whenever they want. They can stop any kind of supply from entering. As you can see, you know, a lot of the blockades were placed up with the events that happened. Now, through the Rafah border, it's basically managed by Egypt, but Egypt has normalized ties with Israel a long time ago. So you can see where their loyalties lie there.
Okay.
To give you some context, right now, we're getting around 20 trucks a day into Gaza with supplies. Pre-siege, yeah, the daily needs of the average life in Gaza, before any kind of bombing, they needed 100 trucks a day.
They needed 100 trucks a day before 7 October events.
Yes.
On like a casual day.
On a casual day. So you can imagine now with the immense strain on infrastructure, the immense strain on the hospitals, not to mention the, 50% of the homes have been bombed in the north of Gaza.
50%?
Yeah. So you've got the strain is immense. People have nowhere to go, they have nowhere to flee.
It's just not homes. We are talking about schools, we're talking about universities,
Yes.
we're talking about hospitals,
Mosques,
we're talking about mosques,
churches.
Churches, in fact, yeah.
Everything that can possibly be bombed.
indiscriminate.
It's indiscriminate bombing across the entire strip. And the most insidious part about it is that there's not a single combatant that has been announced dead from the resistance fighters.
Okay.
Israel is constantly
so the people
saying,
who originally launched an attack, they have not yet been targeted, but those who have been targeted are all civilians.
Exactly.
And they are indiscriminately and disproportionately being killed, murdered.
Yeah. So they use the excuse that the resistance uses the civilians as human shields.
Yeah.
But as we can see from 2021, 2016, 2014, 2005, you can go back so many times, specifically the Gaza Strip bombings. We're not even expanding into the further atrocities. Every single time, the number one and usually only casualty are civilians. Civilians. And, it's ridiculous. The moment they turned off the water, they turned off the electricity, and people are relying on generators. Doctors were operating without anesthesia, using flashlights from phones. And these phones, you have to pay 50 shekel to charge them at stores that do have limited access to electricity. So you need to run early. You need to decide between whether you want to get in line for bread at 5 a.m. or you want to get in line for the electricity charging stations.
And we are not even talking about the gory details of
This is not the gory details.
massacre.
We're not talking about the children dying. We're not talking about any of that kind of, they're using phosphorus bombs, which is against all kinds of international laws. They're using, things that are reminiscent of the napalm bombs that America released on Vietnam, rendering immense burns across the victims' bodies. A very painful way to die.
Let's not even talk about what Muslims are saying per se. We can incorporate the statements by international watchdogs.
Yeah.
The Human Rights Watch has already termed it a genocide. Antonio Guterres of the United Nations have called it crisis of humanity, not a human crisis. Crisis of humanity, as if he has called in question the humanity of an entire world.
Yeah.
Are we talking about a war here? Is it a war? Is it in any way comparable, the two sides here? Could you just plainly walk us through the strength the Gazan people have as opposed to what Israel holds?
So when you look at one of the world's most sophisticated armies, Israel has the 4th strongest army in the world. In the world.
Not just in the Middle East.
Not just in the Middle East. It is strongly backed by many super nations.
And correct me if I'm wrong, America has just given a nod to a $13 billion army aid, the military aid.
Yeah. Just recently announced that they're redirecting funds from Ukraine to support. Most people are for humanity. They're for the freedom of Palestinians. They're for the treatment of human beings. We're not cattle. Even cattle is treated better.
True. So the popular support lies with Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. We have talked enough about the current situation, but why don't you talk to us about the historical context and the Palestinian identity?
It takes us back to understand why the Israelis are in Palestine in the first place. To understand the conflict of land. And I think we should start off by making it clear that the Israelis feel like they have a claim over the land because historically the Israelites were in the region and it is their promised land from God, and so now they're in the right capacity to be in that area. If we decided who could be in a certain space just based off of their ancestors being there, I think a lot of the world as we know it today would be in conflict. No one is really in the place that they're supposed to be or their ancestors were in.
And if they are promised a land, nevertheless, if it's preordained for them, why do they have to trample over the dead bodies of children anyway?
Exactly. And now, just to oversimplify this, to get something you were promised, I don't think you need to take the route of genocide and ethnic cleansing to get there. They're no longer in line with with their own religious word.
How the resistance has played its role, the organic resistance from within Palestine. Let's talk about Edward Said for that matter. Let's talk about Mahmoud Darwish, Hassan Kanafani. Those were the people who have always been secular in their struggle. They have never used religion as a tool to like combat the facts that were otherwise against them. There were no facts against them, obviously. So they used just the secular logic and played their role in a way that inspired the resistance that succeeded.
What we have to understand first is the geography. I think we need to go back to 1917. Maybe Badr can start us off with the Zionist movement.
After the World War I.
Because the makeup of the geography plays a huge role in how the parties rose and in how the players are able to, lead us to Intifada 1, Intifada 2. And so, yeah, we definitely need to set the stage first.
So when it comes to Palestinian identity, the struggle is often who was there first.
And I think a good point here would be, you can trace back Jewish, Islamic, and Christians to Abraham, alayhi salam, Ibrahim. And we are all related. The sons of Ibrahim alayhi salam, one led to the rise of the Israelites, and one led to the rise of the Arabs who later became the Muslims. So we are actually, in Arabic, we call them Mulad al-Am. Yani they're our cousins. And we're both Semitic people. It's such an integral history that you can't just say, oh, the Arabs never existed. Obviously, the genetic makeup will change, the language will change, empires will rise and fall, but people still lived there. People still existed there.
So while we're at it, could you also explain to us why everyone who criticizes so much as Israeli policy that is based on the ostracization of any other race, they are demonized as anti-Semitic? What constitutes anti-Semitism anyway?
I think what we just explained about us being, in a way, cousins.
You just mentioned you are a Semite as well.
Semitics and us being descendants of the Canaanites, both Israelis as well as us, that makes us all part of the same Semitic group. So for people to say that if you were to question the state of Israel, you are branded as anti-Semitic.
Liberally, I would say.
That's
what discourages so many journalists from stating the facts.
What keeps a lot of people...
their objectivity by equating the two sides without any substance to it.
The thing about trying to turn it into a very nuanced issue is that they want us to run in circles discussing these topics. They want us to sanitize our language to appease the colonial powers. Criticizing Israel is not criticizing Judaism.
So for that, I feel like you might need to understand what Zionist means and what is Zionism. So Zionism is the Jewish nationalist movement to create a Jewish state for the Jewish people in the Promised Land, which is the state of Israel.
That explains the nation-state law and the law of return in Israel. That is based off of apartheid against the Palestinians.
Which is immensely racist.
And that's where you get the progressive Jews and the Orthodox Jews who don't stand for those same ideas. You can be a Jew anywhere in the world. No one has an issue with that. But to say that you need to have a land exactly where... Exactly. And they were all branded as Palestinians. They were not branded as a separate entity.
And the funny thing about Zionism is you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. I mean, our buddy over in the US, Biden, proudly states, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist. I'm a Zionist. I'm a proud Zionist. And he's Christian.
And it has also something to do with the race, the skin color, the white supremacy is also playing part in it.
Of course. I mean, if you look at so from 1917 until 1945, in 1917, Balfour, the then Prime Minister of the UK, wrote to Rothschild, who was a Zionist leader. Basically, they declared Palestine as a state like a home for the homeless people. So the Jewish people will get Palestine. At the time, they had made promises to the Arabs. Because at the time, there was a rise in Arab nationalism, and they wanted to overthrow the Ottoman Empire.
Of Mecca, who said
exactly.
Coming to its sunset. And so from 1917 to 1945, there's this huge influx of European Jews and Russian Jews that are coming to this land and laying claim on that land.
Is it also because the Western and imperialist power wanted their foothold in the Middle East, also because they wanted their dominance to sustain in India, and their way through to India was via Suez Canal that passed this region?
I mean, Palestine has a very advantageous location in terms of trade routes, political, machinations. So definitely, why is the West so invested in the Jewish plight? I mean, if you look at the history of Europe and the Jewish people,
they have never been nice to them.
It's never been nice. The Middle East, and especially Palestine, sure, there have been conflicts, but it was never a Jewish versus Muslim issue. There were native Jews, but in Europe, from, the 10th century onwards, there's always been clashes between the European Christians and the Jews. And it got to a point where, they created the Jewish ghettos, not just neighborhoods. You could think they're just neighborhoods, but actually, yeah, they hated Jews so much, they would shove them outside the cities. And they deemed that.
So that was proper anti-Semitism.
Proper anti-Semitism, of course. I mean, anti-Semitism is mostly a Western concept.
And now they are making up for what they did by pitting the Jews against Muslims.
They're definitely not making up. They're just utilizing that issue to create the Israel state, which serves the purposes of the Western superpowers.
Pre-1907, we have 3% of the population of Palestine that's Jewish, that's native Jewish. And then between 1907 all the way to 1945, there's this influx of Eastern European Jews that now make the population of Jews from 3%, bring it up to 33%. That's 1/3 of the Palestinian population now.
That is not native.
That is not native, that's European.
Central and Eastern Europeans of Polish and Hungarian and Russian descent.
And by 1945, that Jewish population owns 7% of the land in Palestine. That's 7% for 33% of the population. 1947 comes about and the UN needs to partition, and they bring up the two-state solution. They need to partition between the Jews and the Palestinians to create Israel and Palestine, or the current territories. Now, they give 33% of the population that owns 7% of the land, they give them 55% of the land, and they give the rest to the Palestinians. Now, mind you, the Palestinians were the majority. There were 67% of the population, and they got 45% of the land.
So the lion's share of the land was taken away, was occupied from the majority of Palestinians, and it was handed over to a minority of people.
Exactly. And then
exodus from their native lands was orchestrated by the European forces themselves.
Exactly. And then to this day, that percentage is constantly changing. The Nakba, or the Great Catastrophe, in which there was a mass exodus of Palestinians, is constantly forced expulsion, displacement of people, that is constantly happening. And so that 55% is now at an 87% of land that is owned and controlled by the occupation.
And this brings us to the modern day makeup of the society. A lot of people have a difficulty imagining Gaza, West Bank, right? Let's just bring it home. You can imagine like Gaza is on the borders of Sindh, right at the bottom. Right at the bottom, tiny strip of land. Then you go up to Lahore, and that's where the West Bank is. And Israel has the north, the south, and all of the middle. And the West Bank, by the by, is still under Israeli territory. 80% of the water is controlled by them. There's checkpoints in every single area. You don't even have access to roads that are open freely to illegal settlers. So this is another aspect of the displacement, is that they bring in illegal settlements on Palestinian land. So this is internationally recognized Palestinian territory. And they bring these Jewish settlers, they build these illegal settlements, redirecting water and electricity lines to these settlements at the expense of the Palestinians.
So that explains the settler colonialism term.
Exactly. And that brings us to, so you can imagine a people that is so frustrated, that is so without rights, that is constantly beaten. Can you imagine your father, your brother, your sister? No, like immediately, anyone can stop them, anyone can pat them down. Just recently, in the past couple weeks, 5,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been apprehended by Israelis and the IDF and placed into prisons illegally. And how did they do that? A lot of the labor force in Israel is Palestinian. So what they did is they posted fake jobs. And then they took these laborers to places where they kidnapped them and they transported them. Yeah, and they transported them from those areas to IDF prisons illegally. Just yesterday, Ahid Tamimi, who is a very famous activist, she's a young woman, she's 22 years old. has been apprehended, and they literally barged into her home, turned the house upside down. You can see things thrown here and there. Her father was detained before that, and they don't know where his whereabouts are. I think he was on the border of Jordan or something.
And none of this happens on legal ground.
None of it.
Yeah, while we are at it, why don't you talk us through the international bodies who have been overseeing this issue for the past, I don't know, innumerable years, what they have been doing, and then while you are still at it, could you also add what common person can do to amplify the voices of the Palestinians?
I mean, when you talk about international bodies, I'd go back to what I just said about the UN. The UN clearly favored the Israelis, the minority of the population, gave them a larger chunk of the land. Really, it's unfair when we think of like what the average person can do. My way to go is BDS, 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 which is boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. Do you want to explain what that is?
So the boycotts, divestments, and sanctions movement, we're going to focus specifically on boycott because that's at the individual level. Okay. Basically, it is the refusal to purchase any kind of goods that supports, funds, or in any way, shape, or form gives some kind of support to the colonial state. So not only do they take our land, they also take our culture. They say that hummus is Israeli, shakshuka is Israeli. There's so many things that they've tried to appropriate and steal for their own. And they profit off of us. They say, oh, Palestinian majdoul dates, but it's actually Israeli processed. Even the Palestinian pro-Palestine shirts you see now on Amazon, they're being put up online by Zionist supporters, and all the proceeds are going to the IDF. There's lists of organizations that we should boycott. If there's a local alternative, go for the local alternative.
It also supports the local economy.
Exactly. If there isn't a local alternative, you don't need it.
It may seem like the benefits are targeted towards the Palestinians. We boycott and the Palestinians benefit. It's really not that. You boycott and the Pakistani economy benefits. You provide local companies and startups and innovators with opportunities, and you're putting your money where your mouth is.
But also in its cascading effect somewhere down the line, it also somehow benefits this Palestinian cause, if not the Palestinian.
Of course. It's a win-win situation, and I can't think of a reason you wouldn't want to do it.
White supremacists and the colonial forces have often, without any remorse, termed Arabs as barbarians, as savages. But over this period of time, we have seen so many faces that came up with literary resistance, artistic resistance. They have rallied support from all over the world, obviously barring the states and the state forces.
I mean, we can take a look at Edward Said. Edward Said is a very notable author. His work, he's a Christian, yes, he's a Christian. And his work has transformed the way that the world in general approaches Orientalism and like you said, the dissociation of humanity from Arabs and from other colored people. You know, if you look at like the white people in their literature, so much of it is rooted in racism. You can look at The White Man's Burden, the poem.
Rudyard Kipling. Samuel Huntington.
Yeah.
Clash of Civilization.
It's so like they have the burden to civilize the barbarian, which is not true when you look at just how much innovation.
It's like a messiah complex.
Yeah, of course. It's ridiculous. This white savior complex that is so insidious because it sets us apart. It puts them as the superior and us as the inferior. But the matter of fact, that's totally not true. In fact, Islam and Arabs and, you know, Indian Muslims, Pakistani Muslims have constantly innovated across the centuries that Islam has been around, right? North Africans. So it's not true. I mean, you can look at the poetry of Mahmoud Darwish. Beautiful poetry. It's so moving, it's so touching. You can look at the cartoonist Najil Ali, who was taken out by the Mossad in London. He was maybe 40 years old. And his political cartoons managed to, you know, convey a message across in a time where there was no social media. People just had a few minutes to look at newspapers. Ghassan Kanafani in his books, both fiction and non-fiction. Fairuz has sang for Palestine. If you look at the singing style of the Tarwida is a cipher. Even to Arabs, we can't decipher it. But the people, they knew, because back then, the British had cut off the communication lines between the people and the resistance. So what did the women do? They created a singing style that conveyed messages of love and also support, and also hidden messages of like, oh, the British are in the northern shore. And they would sing it on the side of the road as resistance fighters would pass by. And no one would be, so even the Arabic speaking spies wouldn't be able to tell what they're saying.
So what's happening in Gaza at the moment, we can talk about it for hours on end. but obviously this session has to end at some point. So far, it's been a month and 10,000 plus people have been killed, most of them being children. Despite that, the ceasefire talk is still in the negotiation phase. We don't know when will it commence. Even after a ceasefire, it will take decades for the people there, for the victims of this savagery to recover from what happened. We can talk about the infrastructural rehabilitation, but we must also talk about the post-traumatic distress that these people will suffer. For now, I'll just bid adieu to our guests. Thank you, Laila. Is there anything you would want to add to this?
I just want to thank you so much for having us on. And in response to your last statement, inshallah, not just a short-term resolution, but a long-term resolution. We will be getting rid of this colonial stain, and inshallah, Palestine will be free from the river to the sea.
Like Laila said, free Palestine from the river to the sea.
It's an honor for us. Thank you so very much, both of you. Thank you. Let's pray that the world powers come to their senses. And till that point, we should keep talking about what's going on.